Russia-Ukraine conflict - Associated Press, why Russia may be about to win over Ukraine and the West. Ukraine's much-anticipated counterattack failed to achieve a breakthrough that would give Kiev a strong position in negotiations. While Russia has reason to believe that time is in its favor, Russia still stands firm. According to World Journal, the conflict in the Middle East dominates the media, and America's support for Kiev is showing signs of slowing down due to conflicting views of both parties, not to mention the bias of the United States. Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump's support for Mr. Putin. The Russian leader has reason to believe that time is supporting him. On the front line, there are no signs that Moscow is losing. Russia's economy was heavily affected, but not to the point of exhaustion. Paradoxically, the president's power was strengthened after the failed rebellion of Wagner forces led by Yevgeny Prigozhin in June. Popular support for Russia during the conflict remained steady, and elite support for Kremlin appeared unbroken. Promises by Western officials to revive their defense industries have run into bureaucratic and supply chain obstacles, while sanctions and export controls have hampered efforts. Russia's special military operations forces are much less than expected. Russia's defense plants are ramping up production, and Soviet-era legacy plants are performing better than Western plants. When it comes to much-needed items like artillery shells, the engineers responsible for running the Russian economy have proven adaptable. High oil prices are partly due to close cooperation with the Arab world, which is filling state coffers. On the contrary, the other side depends heavily on Western aid. The head of the Kremlin can also be pleased when looking at his foreign policy. His investments in important relationships have paid off. China and India have provided an important fulcrum for the Russian economy by increasing imports of Russian oil and other goods. Instead of worrying about losing markets in Western Europe and EU sanctions, President Putin decided that it would be more profitable in the short term to simply become a more dependent partner of China. In the economic sector, goods from China account for nearly 50% of Russia's imports, and Russia's leading energy companies are switching to selling to China. Even neighboring countries such as Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, despite certain reservations, have also made huge profits by acting as facilitators of sanctions circumvention and as transit points for goods that Russia previously used direct import. None of this should come as a surprise. More than 6 months before the conflict broke out in February 2022, Vladimir Putin issued a new national security strategy for Russia, the main purpose of which is to prepare the country for a long-term confrontation with the West. Today the Russian leader can tell the whole country that his strategy is working. Russia will not give in. Mr. Putin does not seem to feel any pressure to end the conflict or worry about the possibility of maintaining it indefinitely as winter approaches. Russia has launched a limited offensive on the ground and will certainly expand its missile and drone attacks on cities, power plants, industrial zones and critical infrastructure. At a minimum, Putin expects that European support for Kiev will dissipate and that Ukrainians will tire of the endless horror and destruction inflicted on them. And that the combination of the two would allow him to dictate the terms for an agreement to end the conflict and win. In the opinion of the head of the Kremlin, the ideal person to reach such an agreement is Donald Trump. If he returns to the White House in January 2025, the Russian leader is ready to weaponize everything to win. During the conflict in Ukraine, nuclear weapons control and European security are hostage to Russia's insistence that the West end its support for Ukraine. What remains of the Cold War-era weapons control framework will be completely destroyed. Disappear. In 2026, and there is an increasing risk of an unpredictable three-way nuclear arms race between the US, Russia and China. The Kremlin boss will use all global and regional issues, whether war or war, Israel, Gaza, food security, or climate action, as a trap to win the conflict with Ukraine and the West. This situation poses an unprecedented challenge for Western leaders. West Washington and its allies have been remarkably effective in resolving the most pressing aspects of this problem, preventing the collapse of Ukraine, providing full of advanced weapons and real-time intelligence information for this country, as well as taking long-term sanctions against Russia. But now is the time to turn to a long-term strategy to increase and maintain pressure on the Kremlin. There should be no illusion that any feasible combination of short-term steps will be enough to force Putin to stop conflict. What Western leaders have clearly not done is be level with their publics about the long-term nature of the threat from a revisionist Russia, which they regularly bet on. Sanctions, a successful counterattack by Kiev, or the transfer of new weapons to force the Kremlin to sit at the negotiating table. During the Cold War, American foreign policy thinkers did not place bet on a sudden change of heart by the Kremlin or the collapse of the Soviet system. Instead, they put their faith in the long-term vision of opposing a regime and making the necessary investments on the defense and military capabilities of the alliances. Today's containment policy means continuing Western sanctions, isolating Russia diplomatically, preventing the Kremlin from meddling in politics internally, while strengthening NATO's defense and deterrence capabilities, including sustained U.S. European reinvestment in the defense industrial base. It also means minimizing any diplomatic, military, and economic damage caused by the Ukraine conflict. Embarking on a global competition with Kremlin will not be a wise investment of Washington, because it will push America into a meaningless game of fighting all manifestations of Russian influence. Moreover, today's situation is very different from the threat from the Soviet Union. Europe is no longer the wasteland was devastated as it was after World War II. NATO has welcomed 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. The most important thing, contrary to all predictions, Ukraine has stood firm against Russia's onslaught. In less than 2 years, their army destroyed Russia's decade of military modernization, motivating Ukraine to continue fighting and providing ammunition to the country as President Biden pledged. In his speech, January 19, is not charity but the most urgent and cost-effective element of Western strategy. Equally important is helping Kiev move towards its rightful place in Europe. No Eastern European country in Europe has gone through what Ukraine is going through. Now rebuilding the country will be a generational undertaking, not only for the people but also for their many friends, partners, and allies. Maintaining cohesion and determination among our Western allies, the West, is essential to leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. The Kremlin has long mastered the art of causing division between the United States and its allies. The prospect of Putin eventually leaving politics has sparked talk of a new strategic opening to Russia that could somehow woo Moscow, now much more difficult. Much because whoever can replace Mr. Putin will have to end the war and engage in serious negotiations. Indeed, the United States and its allies clearly understand the long-term nature of this reality. The war is over. Whenever that happens, it will be difficult to quell the confrontation between Russia and the rest of Europe. Ukrainians and their friends have good reason to want to see the rise of an independent state. Establishment of secure prosperity and full integration into the political and economic life of the continent. Putin and his successors will consider it Russia's final defeat. They will do everything in their power. Ourselves to prevent that. The current situation of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Army, Valery Zaluzhnyi, gave an interview to the British economic weekly The Economist, admitting that the counterattack had failed on the same day. Vasily Dandikin, one of Russia's major strategists, had an analysis of the current state of the war in Ukraine as well as the possibility of the conflict progressing. According to the author, Ukraine's current failure is due to strategic miscalculations by the United States and its Western allies. Author Vasily has a doctorate in political science at the Far Eastern Institute. The author's article clearly shows Russia's comments on the developments of this conflict. The following is a summary of the article. First of all, the author Vasily reiterates that the purpose of Ukraine's counterattack is to give Russia a serious strategic defeat by cutting the land corridor connecting to the Crimean Peninsula. However, since the beginning of this counterattack, Ukraine has never been able to penetrate the defenses established by the Russian army. Ukraine has suffered heavy losses. In the face of an exhausted Russian army, with extremely small numbers, it had to fight on a long front line. Only when the river crossing stations were in danger of being destroyed did the Russian army withdraw to the left bank. Observing what happened, it seemed imprudent. If you expect Ukraine to have success, in the current new conditions, by the summer of 2023, the Russian army will be in an overwhelming position. The defense line will be perfectly equipped and reinforced. The mobilization of the defense industry began to yield tangible results, so the real goal of the counteroffensive was not to defeat the Russian army, which was now in control, but to force Moscow to negotiate terms favorable to the West. But to do this, the West must first show that Ukraine still retains the initiative. The next strategy is to inflict heavy damage on the Russian army. This will destabilize the situation in the country and would ultimately allow Ukraine to claim victory. Ukraine's counteroffensive pursues more political than strategic goals, and the main criterion of success appears to be developments in Russian social psychology. This was Kiev's main signature plan throughout the conflict. Most of these Ukrainian efforts and probably most of its losses were related to campaigns designed to create a powerful media effect. This is clearly demonstrated through actions such as the defense of Ngongkwang's supposed fortress cities in clearly unfavorable conditions. Risky incursions by the specially trained sabotage units enter former Russian territories, or attack symbolic targets in Russian cities. Kremlin skyscrapers in Moscow. Perhaps this strategy is the result of a thoughtless desire to introduce Western-style thinking into Russian society into the public's attitude towards war. Through the overseas military campaigns such as the wars in Vietnam and Iraq, author Vasily compares Ukraine to playing a bad martial arts teacher in a Hong Kong martial arts movie by using his hands to press acupressure points, hoping to paralyze his abilities, causing harm to an opponent who is said to have physical strength and a muscular body. But this master does not know much about anatomy, so he always hits the wrong acupuncture points, hitting places with very few nerve endings. As for the opponent, with NATO, the author notes that Russian society only agreed to defeat and withdrew from the conflict after many bitter defeats on the battlefield, such as being surrounded and defeated by large armies. Any smaller defeat will only encourage Russia to use more and more of its resources to achieve victory, and on this front Russia clearly has the upper hand over Ukraine, even combined. The failure of the counter-offensive showed that the strategy of ending the conflict under acceptable conditions for the West had reached an impasse. These were the conditions. The United States and its allies have never seriously considered returning to the borders of 1991 or before February 23, 2022. The comprehensive territorial issue of Ukraine is also not among the priorities of the United States and European countries. Similarly, the desire to annex many new territories was not the main motivation for Moscow to launch a special military campaign. According to Vasily, the cause of this conflict was disagreement over Ukraine's position in the system. Regional security. Russia has sought to eliminate Ukraine as a potential source of threat by forcing it to maintain a neutral position and accept restrictions on its defense industry and armed forces. For the United States it is important to keep Kiev as a potential military bridgehead. Therefore, for Washington, an acceptable outcome of the conflict is that Ukraine loses a significant part of its territory but still remains as a U.S. outpost with subsequent rearmament and deployment of U.S. military bases. In other words, it does not matter to the U.S. how much land Ukraine loses as long as the country is still able to survive financially. Economic aspect, that is, Ukraine controls its economic and political centers by ending the conflict under conditions. Thus, in the near future, the United States can temporarily reduce military support spending for Kiev and thus have the effect of freezing the conflict. That could help the United States focus on the ongoing crises in different parts of the world. In the future, with Ukraine being integrated into the system of Western institutions and led by an anti-Russian nationalism, Washington could very well use this country at any time as a military tool to prevent or defeat Russia strategically. For Moscow, such an outcome means there is a high possibility of a new war with much greater destructive power, perhaps in the not-too-distant future. Of course, this war is not predetermined. Even assuming that the conflict ends under conditions acceptable to Washington, many other problems could take a turn for the worse. For example, the United States will likely become bogged down in conflicts in China East with Iran and its allies. If the US encounters difficulties in these regions of the world, they will not be able to return to the project of rebuilding and arming Ukraine. However, the problem here is just probabilities that depend on many factors that, according to Russia, has little or no influence, so the plan with Russia must be based on the worst-case scenario, which is the rapid rearmament of Ukraine. So looking from Moscow's point of view, NATO will not cease to exist until this danger is eliminated. In March 2022, Russia came close to accepting a peace agreement under which it would not take new territories but would receive guarantees on demilitarization and neutrality from Ukraine. However, this agreement was hindered due to direct involvement from the US and UK, according to many reliable sources. Since then the situation has changed. Russia is faced with the task of protecting its external borders. Outside of the 4 new territories, the high threat of sabotage provocations or acts of terrorism from Kiev may create the need to reach out to other borders. In any case, the territorial issue, the territory will be resolved on the battlefield. The current border will most likely lie along the contact line between the two sides at the time of the ceasefire. There are many signs that Ukraine is running out of human resources, such as allowing military conscription from postgraduate students, female doctors to disabled people, and people suffering from chronic infections and mental disorders. God often forced soldiers to join the army, beat those who escaped the army. The loss of life was higher, the ability to compensate was such that it was difficult for Kiev to survive in the long term. A consequence of the continuous renewal of the merit list. People subject to military service are lowering the quality of new recruits and increasing the number of victims on the battlefield. All of these moves are only in exchange for the fragile existence of a state with the ability to control society. Is being restricted because of widespread corruption and military evasion. These observations suggest that the West is wrong to assume that both Ukraine and Russia are unlikely to conduct large-scale counterattacks. If this is true in the case of Ukraine, then there is no reason to conclude that Russia will not be able to achieve a breakthrough on the battlefield. Compared to the enemy, the Russian army continuously increases the number of troops and equips many new and more modern weapons in both quantity and quality, such as the reconnaissance drones and artillery shells may be able to attack autonomously thanks to artificial intelligence and recognition technology. Weapons that Russia did not have a year ago can now be allowed. The Russian army is on equal footing, even surpassing its opponents. Finally, conflict broke out in central Vietnam on October 7, 2023. And each threat of a major military political crisis grew. In Asia in 2024 has resulted in the US reallocating military resources and reducing support for Ukraine. Therefore, the ability to launch a major attack from now on depends heavily on the ability to deploy new tactics of the Russian military to overcome the current stagnant crisis.